Okay, good morning. We're going to continue in Chapter 8, Section 1, talking about hypothesis testing. And I'm going to go over the three different types of tests based on what type of research hypothesis we set up. These are in no particular order. Two-tailed test. Now, in all of these, I should just go ahead and write it out ahead of time. We're going to be saying the population parameter, so that's mu in all of these ones, is equal to a certain value. So remember, our H subscript 0 is always a statement of equality, right? So for a two-tailed test, we are always going to use a two-tailed test whenever we have an alternative hypothesis that is just a simple inequality, right? So our null hypothesis is always mu equals k. For a two-tailed test, we're going to say that it is what? Just not equals. That's it. All right. So here, right-tailed. Okay, that's how I spell right. Right-tailed test is coming from when we have H subscript 0 stated as mu is equal to k, right? So I said that part's going to be the same for all of these. For a right-tailed test, we're going to be saying that mu is greater than whatever that value is, okay? So in the previous example, I believe it was part A, where the researcher was conjecturing that the young people spent more than $30 a day gambling. Couldn't remember what it was for a little moment there. Okay, and then as you might have guessed, the last type of statistical hypothesis test we can do is when our null hypothesis is mu is equal to k, right? Because it always will be. And here H1 is going to be going to the left. Mu is less than k. All right. So these are our three types of hypothesis tests. Okay, another definition. A statistical test is coming up next Tuesday. Just kidding. It's my attempt at humor. A statistical test is basically just a computation that we do with the data that we've gathered in order to make a decision about whether we should reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis. So rather than writing all of that down, we'll just say it's a computation and the test value or test statistic is the numerical value or result of that computation. All right. The next things that we're going to have to talk about here are type 1 and type 2 error. So in terms of making our decision, whether we reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis, there is the possibility that we might be making the wrong decision. So there's two types of ways that we can make the wrong decision, unfortunately. Right? We'll talk about the level of significance for our statistical test, and then we'll get into the methodology itself of performing a traditional hypothesis test. Okay, so as I mentioned here, we'll talk about this way. I'll say rejecting H subscript 0. Okay, what does this mean? Okay. Let's go through a simple analogy. Let's say this. Let's suppose I came up to you and I said, this morning I drank 5 gallons of coffee. All right. Well, if you have no other information, you basically have to say, well, okay, until I can prove otherwise, I'm just going to have to assume that you drank 5 gallons of coffee, right? I don't know why in this example I'm calling this mu. I'm just using this as an example of something like this for a test parameter, right? So here I'm saying it's an average, right? Okay, and you say to me, okay, well, all right, I guess so. I'll take your word for it. Fine. I don't have any other reason to disbelieve you, so I'm just going to go with the status quo of saying, sure, yeah, you drank 5 gallons of coffee. Or oh, here, I can tie it in. You drink an average of 5 gallons of coffee every day, right? Sure. Right? Well, whereas if you go out and gather information and you say, well, that can't be. You have to drink a lot more coffee than that. I've seen you. So my claim might be mu is greater than 5 gallons of coffee on average per day for Grenfell. Wow, a lot of coffee. All right, but here's the thing: you can't accept the alternative hypothesis. You can't accept the null hypothesis. Here's all you can do: is you can reject the null hypothesis. You can say, you know what? The information that I've gone out and gathered suggests that is not true. The data says otherwise. And so if I reject the null hypothesis, this is out, then what else remains? This. Okay? So I have not proved that the alternative or research hypothesis is absolutely true. What we're determining with a statistical test, or a statistical test, is whether there's any evidence that contributes to my claim. All right? So if I don't gather enough evidence, I just say, okay, well, my claim didn't amount to anything. Nothing changed, right? Sure, yeah, you didn't see any evidence otherwise, so you're just going to say, yeah, sure, he's telling us the truth. He drinks an average of 5 gallons of coffee a day, right? But if you go out and you gather evidence, and you look at your sample, and you do this statistical test computation, you compute the test value, and you perform the rest of the hypothesis test process, and you say, nope, I reject the null hypothesis, then we're going to just say, well, okay, the only other alternative is the alternative hypothesis. So we kind of tacitly accept that. We don't accept anything. We either reject or we fail to reject and just kind of settle with whatever is left. Okay? We don't accept, we settle. Slight distinction. All right, now let's go over types of error. Okay, so the two main types of error, there's type 1 error and type 2 error. Okay, so make a little grid, a little chart in terms of, well, you know, what is the underlying reality of the situation, and what is our decision? Sure. Okay. All right. So in reality, we are not proving reality here. we're just assuming that, you know, if we could go out and see, we could say H1 is true here. Hang on one second. Put this a little bit further back. All right. So here H1 is going to be true, and over here H1, H subscript 0, the null hypothesis is false. Okay, so this is reality. This is what is actually the truth. All right, regardless of what data we get, regardless of what decision we make, this is truth or falsehood of the null hypothesis. Okay, and over here, let's look at our decisions. Okay, we could do two possible things. We can reject H subscript 0, or we can, ran out of colors, we can do not reject H subscript 0. And those are essentially the four possibilities that we could do, right? That we could have, right? H subscript 0 could be true, and we could reject H subscript 0. Okay. Or we could have H subscript 0 true, and we could say do not reject H subscript 0. Okay. What else? Well, we could be over here. We could be in the realm where H subscript 0 was actually false, and we make the decision to reject H subscript 0. And then the fourth final possibility is we have H subscript 0 false, and we do not reject H subscript 0. So there are the four different scenarios for the reality of the situation and our decision that we make. Okay, now two of these are not the correct decision. So we'll label that as an error. So what happens if the null hypothesis is true and yet we reject the null hypothesis? Well, I'm shading that box in red because that is what? That is a bad decision. We have the reality of the situation saying that this is true, and we came and said, no, it's not true, throw it away, throw it in the garbage. Right? Well, let's see. Over here, if we have H subscript 0 being true and we don't reject it, that would be a correct decision. Put a little check mark there. Right? What happens if H subscript 0 is actually false and our decision is to take that and throw it away? Well, that's perfect. Okay? And then the other type of mistake is this. See? Here we are in the situation where H subscript 0 is not true, it's false, and yet we say, okay, it's fine, keep it. Okay, so we've got two errors that we could make, and they're two different types of errors, right? We're saying two different, slightly different things. They're both wrong, but they're both slightly different. So this is hang on one second. Let me just say we'll say type 1 error, and this is, as you might have guessed, this is type 2 error. Okay, kind of an interesting, or kind of makes it a little bit more tangible. The book has an analogy or an example. All right, it's about our criminal justice system. Okay, and let's see here. Let's get to that. So here we're going to basically have the same situation. It's all pertaining to H subscript 0, right? Here it's true. In this column it's false. And in this row we reject H subscript 0, and here the last row we don't reject H subscript 0. All right, and so for this particular situation, the analogy that we're going to consider is this. There is a defendant who is on trial, okay? The null hypothesis, at least the way it works in our criminal justice system, is what? That they're innocent. They didn't do it, okay? That is built into our Constitution, the presumption of innocence, that we have to assume, unless there is enough evidence that amasses, that builds up, and we can say, yes, all of that suggests that you did it, right? Our initial assumption is that the defendant is innocent. So what would the alternative be? Is that they're not innocent, they're guilty. Okay? So here, if we knew everything, we could say it's either true or it's false, right? Those are the two possibilities that we've broken it down into. All right? And what would our errors be? So remember that this is the correct decision and this is the correct decision. Okay? It's true that they are innocent, and so we do not convict them of this crime. So that is the correct decision there. All right? Or if it is false that they are innocent, so they are guilty, and we reject their innocence, we convict them, that would be another correct decision. But we've got two possibilities where the criminal justice system could go wrong. That would be a type 1 error, right? Where they are truly innocent, and yet we convict them and send them to prison. So type 1 error is we've sent an innocent person to jail. We've convicted them of a crime, even though they were innocent, right? So that is what we'll think about when we're thinking about type 1 error. We'll say, okay, that's an innocent prisoner, okay? Versus here, type 2 error would be what? That that they're not innocent. It's false. H1 is false, or sorry, H subscript 0 is false, but we say, it's okay, they didn't do it, they're good, don't convict them, acquit them, right? So that would be an instance where they actually are guilty, but we set them free, or we don't convict them. All right, so that's the distinction between type 1 error and type 2 error. Okay. Now, one of these we'll be able to control, and we'll talk about that in the next video. Right.